Hey there, and welcome back to Don't Open That Door. It's Dan, Nico, and Just. We hope you're having an amazing Halloween season so far, and we're back with another bonus episode. Dan, what are we talking about today?
So this week we are exploring horror in literature.
So that's books for those of us who are unenlightened, right?
Books.
Oh, word?
Things you read.
Yo,
Pages.
if someone doesn't know what literature is, you might want to stop listening to this pod and go read a book.
But they can't 'cause they don't know what that is.
Pew, pew, pew.
But nah, so to kind of cut straight to the chase here, we have to ask a very big question, which is, are books still relevant? You know, being one of the biggest and oldest, aside from oral tradition or like maybe some cave paintings or stuff like that. I mean, horror put to text is some of the oldest things we have. But how do they stand up in the modern world? Just let me get that out of the way first. Nico, how do books stand up in the modern world?
I think that is a very hard question to answer. I've obviously got a bit of bias just because as a teacher and as a teacher of such a widely diverse population, some of my kids have been reading their first books ever with me. So I've got definitely more of a skewed representation than probably most people. But I think in general, books haven't really been keeping up with as much prestige as film has these days. You know, the last major big book release that I can think of would be the latest George R.R. Martin joint, and that's not horror, really.
Dan, your take on it. I mean, do horror novels stand up nowadays?
I think that they do. Obviously, films and other more visual media are far and away bigger than books nowadays. But I think that books still very much have a place in media, and I think in
Definitely,
entertainment.
yeah.
And I don't think that they're going to completely die or anything. I hope that they don't. But I think that horror novels and things are still relevant. Not nearly as much as they used to be, but I think they're still relevant.
Yeah, like I've talked to folks my parents' age, and they have said like they remember when Salem's Lot came out, and that was like taking the nation by storm and stuff, and it was a really big conversation piece. And the only thing that I can think of that might be comparable to that, and it's a bit of a cop-out because it's the same author, but when it came out, there was a big resurgence of people reading the novel for the first time, and I don't know if there's been anything like that since in terms of like getting the public eye.
Do you think Fear Street will?
I fucking hope so. I mean, I think for a lot of people, it probably will cause them to go back and reread them. Honestly, I owe it to myself to go and do that. I know there's a bunch of listeners who have read it themselves. So yeah, I'm optimistic now that you've said that, actually.
For sure, for sure. I think from my perspective, I tend to agree with Dan. My viewpoint on the books is this. And we'll talk about part of this a little bit later, but for me, there's something about a book that is a little more personal than a movie. And I think the thing about movies is you can shut your brain off when you watch a lot of movies. A lot of movies are not out here trying to make you, do calculus. With a book, the act of remembering things, a lot of things, is on you. And that's not saying you don't have to remember stuff with movies, but I feel like you have to remember more with books.
Yeah.
And with a book, typically speaking, depending on how fast you read, I would say for most people, it's quicker to watch a movie than it is to read a book. Now, that could change depending on if you're like a fast reader like myself or Nico or whatever, but it really depends on in that side. The thing about movies also is they're so much more accessible. There's just,
definitely,
with all the streaming services we have, everybody's got a phone. Like there's really just not a lot of compulsion to read a book when you can do something that's so much more engaging to your brain, which is a movie. You know what I mean? Like the book is not as big of a hit of dopamine as a movie is. It's just not. And it's another thing where, are you really going to put the time into that? Are you really going to put the effort into that? So I think in terms of popularity, they don't hold up. But I think in terms of scares and horror, personally, I think they do. And that's kind of the next thing I want to talk about, which is, are books as scary now as they were back then? You know, when I say back then, I'm talking about back in those ancient days, right?
Yes, those ancient days.
Like when it was like whoever and whoever sitting around a campfire back in like the ancient caveman days reading, you know, text off a stone tablet. That didn't happen, audience. That's not how history works. But I mean, when it was, you know, the olden times and they didn't have, you know, a ton of film, but they did have books to read. Do you think that they were scarier at that point than they are right now?
I think they must have been, particularly just because back then they didn't have as much visual media. And to be super scientific about it, you know, our brains are fundamentally different now that we've been seeing so much stuff on screens lately. I'm not trying to sound like a fucking boomer or something, but just the way that we consume media is different. There's more of a mental workload when you're reading something because you are doing the act of creating those settings, those scenes in your head. Unless you have aphantasia, which, I mean, sorry, bro, that sucks. But like, if you are a normal person, you are yourself participating in the act of creating that story through your own interpretations. Whereas with film and TV, you're just consuming what the director and everyone already put out there for you.
I see. I see. Dan, do you agree with Nico's point that we're just, because of the exposure we have to the visual media, the book doesn't hit the same way?
Yes, and I also kind of want to expand that to not only to other visual media, but also just the internet and sort of on a larger macro scale, like globalization and whatnot. Because, you know, if you are reading a book in farmland in Scotland
Yugoslavia.
or something, yeah, you know, I
Yugoslavia
think
doesn't
that
exist anymore, fam.
Wait, hold up.
that's true. That's true.
Yes, it fucking does.
No, it doesn't.
No, it fucking doesn't.
Wow. As
No, it
Nico
fucking
catches up to
doesn't.
the last like 30 years of geography, we continue.
Next bonus episode, horror in maps.
But I think now that we have been exposed to so many different cultures and so many different things, and even just like social media and seeing just a lot more stuff, I think it's harder in general, just not just in books, but across the board to scare us, you know. And I think we kind of had, I can't remember when, but we recently had a discussion about kind of like that, like how easy is it to scare people nowadays, and how things have to be more innovative, you know.
No, that's certainly true. Even though I did say, you know, like books are still scary, I think books can still be scary. I do have to agree that they were probably scarier back in the olden times. And, you know, not even to like make myself seem super old, but I remember one time when I was in Trinidad, there was this book of monsters and supernatural creatures. Like it was like a book about them with like a Trinidadian twist and spin on them. And like, trust me, if I could have brought that book back to America, man, I was so stupid. I should have brought that book. But
What was it called? Do you remember?
Nope.
Because I would be really interested in seeing that too.
Like it was awesome, bro. It talked about like all the myths and supernatural things. But anyways, so this was one of those things where I would read it by myself. And when you're in a place where, because the TV we had at that point in time was pretty shit. Like the signal was horrible. You would get maybe like one, possible two channels, one of which was the news. And it was just horrible. But it was one of those things where like I would read that book. And, you know, like back then I had like a Game Boy or something, but like the Game Boy ran out of batteries and I wasn't finding any. So
Books don't have batteries. Pew, pew, pew.
books didn't need batteries, just charged by my imagination. But I would read that and it would scare the shit out of me, bro. I really thought like a Sakunya was going to come for me. Like I really thought that like all these creatures would like, you know, and then you hear a bump in the night and just for a second your mind thinks like, oh shit, is it that? Which is worlds away from where I am right now. So I do think they were scarier back then. So I want to change the tone here. I want to talk about some classic horror novels and authors, just people, books, that have had a massive impact, or even events that have had a massive impact on the genre. I want to start with you, Nico. What's maybe one or two people, places, things that you think have had a massive impact?
So I'm going to make a call back to 5 minutes ago and reference Stephen King. I think he's just one of the absolute legends of the genre, and as well as just a fun writer to study. He's not perfect by any means. He's definitely got some issues, but the man is prolific and very skilled at what he does. When I read it the first time, there hasn't been a second time, which is to say, when I read it, anyway.
Wait, Nico, what did you read?
I read it.
Yeah, what'd you read though?
Yeah,
Anyways.
God damn it. When I read it shortly after the first movie came out, it was fucking nuts. The amount of detail that that Steven goes into, and the descriptions, there's just so much more in that massive fucking tome than you get in the movies. And I still love them. Don't get me wrong, but like The Shining, just anything that you can name, it's iconic. And he's had arguably one of the biggest impacts on horror in literature, media, just period.
Dan, how about you?
Yeah, and I mean, of course, you also got to give it up to Bram Stoker. Stoker?
No. Bram Stoker is someone else.
Stoker. Vinegar Strokes.
Bram Stoker.
AKA Vinegar Strokes.
Bram Stoker.
With Dracula. You got to give it up to classic.
No, that's
Dracula.
my that's my porn star name, Jay Stroker.
Yeah, Jay Stroker.
In honor of Bram Stoker. Fuck. Damn.
We're fucking adults, y'all.
Keep going.
Anyways, also H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes.
For
So I
sure.
was going to say,
Yeah.
somebody hit the turbo racist klaxon. Yeah, so we will say this. Definitely H.P. Lovecraft was a massive
Bitch.
asshole
Piece
and a
of shit.
turbo
Yeah.
racist. Horrible person. But strictly speaking, in terms of influence on the genre, his influence is undeniable.
Yeah.
There is literally, and we've kind of gone back and forth on the pod a little bit. We try to be conscious and refer to the genre as cosmic horror, not Lovecraftian horror. One of the big reasons behind that is just kind of a push to get his name out of it. The concept of the genre can stay, but just trying to get his name out of it. But yeah, like even to this day, one of the most highly rated things we've got on the podcast is Color Out of Space with Nick Cage, which is based on one of his works. There's a lot that we do in horror that is actually taken from some of his stuff. So you're right, Dan. Massive influence. Massive asshole. Massive influence.
Something interesting about that is that since his passing in the 19 whatevers, a lot of people have been sort of reclaiming the mythos and expanding on it outside of, his sort of realm. And they've taken these ideas and ran with it and just created new and even better things than, Howard Phillips Fuckcraft himself could have ever thought of. So it's good to see something evolve. It's good to see something evolve.
I was going to say that as well. I think that just kind of briefly on the topic of Dude, I think that there are minorities, much like myself, who within those original texts, not really portrayed very well at all. And that's saying it nicely. So I think that nowadays you do have a lot of minorities, though, again, like myself, who have taken the works, like you said, Nico, and put their own twist on it, done their own thing. Because, we can enjoy the coming insanity, madness, oblivion without being racist to one another. I think that's one particular horror that I don't really care for much in my texts. So, Dan, any other big influences, whether it's a book, a person, anything else? You got the Stroker. Who else?
Got the Stroker, and then we got the Stein.
Ooh.
Of course.
We talked about him a little bit, of course, in our Fear Street episode.
Right.
But I mean, I think, like I said then, I think he's one of the undercover goats of horror novels. And And I
For
think
sure.
Definitely.
without him, I think a lot of horror wouldn't be as popular as it would be. And because he, introduced younger people to horror and horror novels and novels at a young, impressionable age.
Of course, of course. And for me personally, I was going to pretty much echo the people you talked about. The only other names that I would really bring up are, Junji Ito, if we're going to allow
Good man.
Oh, yeah,
Good
yeah.
fucking man.
if we're going to allow kind of comics into that mix. And I mean, yeah, to talk a little more about, Stephen King, I went through a massive Stephen King kick when I was 16 years old, and I read, I think, everything. I might have missed a couple books, but I mean, I read everything, even the stuff he wrote as like Richard Bagman or whatever the hell his pen name was initially. But
Frodo
like,
Baggins.
but no, like I read everything, and it had a massive impact because at that point in time, I was still kind of coming out of my being scared of movies and stuff like that. And like one thing that definitely helped me was reading the books was scary, but because, the books are all generated by you, by your mind, the only thing I had to scare me was me. So
Bruh.
that, in a weird way kind of helped. So good enough. Good enough. But Dan, I want to kind of pierce your mind real quick.
Go ahead.
Do you think that there's anything that works better as a book versus, say, a movie?
I would say cosmic horror.
Why is that?
Because cosmic horror at its foundation is about the unimaginable. And I think that when you try to put it to visuals in a film or video game or whatever that may be, I think that takes away from the struggle to imagine something, I guess. Because when a character sees these, ancient gods or, whatever that drives them insane, you as the reader, you are trying to picture this and figure out what could be doing that. And I think that's cool. But as, in a video, there's a visual to it, and that it's not unknown anymore because you see it. And in film, they have to get creative and figure out ways to keep it unimaginable while still giving it some sort of face or avoiding it somehow or doing whatever. But I think that works a little bit better in book form, written form.
I definitely agree with you. To your point, I read The Dunwich Horror by the aforementioned racist, and I saw a version of The Dunwich Horror. It was a movie, came out, I think, in like the 70s or 80s, maybe even 60s. But the movie was not very good. And one of the reasons why is because it ran into some pretty severe difficulties with that kind of unknown. There's a part in the book where one of the townspeople or whatever, he glances and he sees, like the Dunwich Horror or like a monster through like a binoculars or a telescope lens or something like that. And just the sight of it alone like fucks him up. And in a movie, if you were to see what he saw, it'd be like, okay, well, that's kind of scary, but like he's overreacting. So I think I agree with you there. Nico, your thoughts on that? Or anything you think is better in books?
I'm going to be a bit of a fucking downer, and I'm sorry. I think that something that works particularly well in literature is just the awful reality of nonfiction. I mean, y'all read Night? That's just terrifying. Remember all the horrific descriptions that were just true, like this shit actually happened? I don't know if we can consider that to be necessarily horror, but if you take a step back and try and view the text just as a text, I think it absolutely qualifies. Similarly, just, again, I hate to be a downer, but just reading about shit in the news, man, like, it's not only depressing, but it's, again, fucking terrifying to think about. I wish I had some sort of witty aside that would make this, turn around, but unfortunately, I just don't.
Definitely. And one thing that I also think from my perspective, and this is a very specific example, and you knew I was going to bring it up at some point, Dracula. So I don't think they will ever make a movie that I guess very succinctly follows the way that the book is written, only because the way the book is told is through journal entries.
Yeah, it's an epistolary novel.
And that's right, it's a piss novel. And it
I swear to God.
it literally is told through these entries. And when you read the entries, yes, right? Like obviously the movie tend to take the act of giving you a visual element to what the characters are writing in their journal. But there is something personal about writing in a journal versus seeing something from like a third party point of view, you know? Like when, you know, Dr. Seward is writing about Lucy, that is like that's some real shit. Like that's some real shit. You can feel what he's talking about. And yes, obviously you can see that in a movie, but a journal entry is even more personal. So I think that. I also think like really large exposition dumps are done way better in a book than they are in a movie or a
I
visual
agree
setting.
with that. Yeah.
Definitely agreed.
Because like how many times have you seen a movie that sat there for like 20 minutes trying to explain something to you and you're like, bruh, like I get it. I understand. Like let's move on. Because in a book, you know, you can kind of read through that pretty quickly. The text doesn't require all the time that visuals do.
That's actually a really good point, because the pacing at that point is up to you.
Yes, I agree with your point that I've made a good point. Good on you,
Nice.
Nico.
Here
So
for you, bud.
as a quick like second aside, is there anything that, you know, that you think just doesn't work in books in terms of horror?
Sound effects.
Well played. Dan?
Audio and visuals.
Well, you heard it first here, folks. These people were both deprived of childhood, never had a book where you could press it and you could hear the sound. So,
Shit isn't Harry Potter.
nah, bro, you
fuck
never,
Harry Potter.
you never did, like it was like you opened the book, cow go, murr, like you never did that.
No, I've seen birthday cards like that though.
I have done that, Justin. I have done that. So I'm here for that. I'm here for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess before we kind of get to the wrapping it up phase, how do books scare people, do you think? We talked a little bit about being scared from books. What do books do that scare you? Because it's just a book, right?
I think a big part of it, as I guess as with all horror, but especially books, is building tension. And I think that well, really just books in general, not just horror books, but books in general, I think do a better job at building tension than films do, personally. Uh, as a whole, obviously there are exceptions and everything, but so I think that books just do, horror novels typically do a better job of building tension because I think that they have to, more so than a film. Like obviously a film that builds tension is way more effective, but it could rely on the visual aspect of it. But a book doesn't really have much else going for it if you're not building that tension.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, actually. I think books definitely build tension a lot more, but because there is no visual typically associated with a book, it's a little bit different for, you know, graphic novels and such. But for like books, I think one thing that stands out is all the visuals and stuff like you're painting, right? So
Mhm.
all these scenes, and so they're automatically like interpreted in the way that would scare you. So for example, so when I saw the design of Pennywise in the new It movies, I thought that motherfucker looked silly. Like that was not how I would have personally designed Pennywise. So, but when I was reading the book though, and which by the way, I'm a true supporter and read it back in '06, no, I'm playing. But when I read the book for the first time, my imagination of Pennywise was more terrifying to me. May not have been more terrifying to anyone else, but to me, that was like my perfect terrorizing Pennywise. So I do think that is one way that books scare people. Also, who hasn't gotten into their own head? Who hasn't second guessed at a bump in the night? And movies can do the same, but like for me, when it's a book, I always like can hear like the lines from the book in my head that like describe how I'm thinking. So definitely that. But Nico, your thoughts?
So one thing that I think books really succeed in doing better than any other medium is point of view. In particular, we can get much more of an eye into what characters are feeling, thinking, and just their thought processes and all that you just can't get that in a visual media as well. And towards that end, something that I think is really fun in books is the idea of unreliable narrators and how that can work itself into your head and just make you even question the act of what it is you're reading. And I think that adds a very unique element of horror that doesn't work as well in visual media oftentimes, because when you're watching something, there is kind of a tacit understanding that, oh, yeah, this is real most of the time, or at least well, thank you.
I'm giving Nico an official round of applause here, because I fucking hate that shit when I see it in movies. I fucking hate that shit. I know you do. I know you do. I hate that shit when I see it in movies. I'm typically not a fan of that. But in books, I feel less quote unquote cheated #ghost stories. So yes, like I definitely agree with that point, Nico, that you've just made.
Thank you.
To kind of square this all off, bring this one to a cease, I only have 2 more questions for you. First, everyone on the pod, what is the scariest book you've read?
So the scariest book for me was not quite a horror novel. I guess it was more of like a thriller or something. What was it called? Like When I Sleep or something like that? That I swear to God, Justin, that was your book. Even though you swear it wasn't your book. It was fucking your book. It's definitely not my book.
Yeah, I know what book you're talking about. That's your book, yeah.
Nah, bro. But it's about this woman who she has memory issues. So she writes notes as to like, to keep reminding her what happened or whatever. And she's trying to figure out what has happened. And if I remember correctly, she had like an accident or something that caused this to happen. So as the story goes on, you find out that like it's all from her perspective. So she starts questioning if these notes are real, or she's going to see the doctor, but can she actually trust the doctor? And because she's getting other information from this other person too, and it's kind of gets kind of scary, because at the end or near the end, she has like a stalker who is getting closer to her and everything, and it gets really, really intense. But that actually just how real it could be, and thinking about all that was just terrifying to me.
Nico, how about you?
So I am going to cop out and shout out 2 things in particular.
Go for it.
One being a manga, just since we reviewed it recently. Honestly, Uzumaki was fantastic and truly a sight to behold. The amount of detail that Junji Ito puts into these scenes that just make the skin crawl down your spine, it's like every other page it's something new. But in terms of a good old wordy book, I'm gonna have to throw it up to, honestly, The Shining. That's my favorite work of King's, and it is just it's something else. I adore the movie, and I adore the book equally well, and that is one of the few pieces of media that I think is just as good in both versions. Very different, but just as good.
All right. My scariest book, I'm probably blanking on something. My mind probably, made me forget the true scariest book. But for me, the scariest book I've read is actually It, because it's something where...
What book?
How the tables have tabled. So now I'm in a situation where, like we're getting older, and when I read It for the first time, I was closer to the age of the kids. Now I am closer to the age of the adults than I am the kids. And it's one of those things where the concept itself, I think, scares me, because in my childhood, I went through a lot of shit that I would class as like supernatural or scary or something. And then, just even the thought process of you wrote it out of your mind. It's not real, but then one day it comes back and oh my God, it is real. And you have to deal with it now. And just, I mean, it's fucked up. I forget who it is. Is it Eddie, right? Who, you know, doesn't even make it back to Derry. I always forget who.
I think that's who it is, but I can't remember off the top of my head. It's been a while.
I always forget. It was the dude who's like always, his mom was mad overbearing. But like,
Yeah.
that blew me so much that he didn't even get the chance to do it. And then like, that book really fucked me up. And I saw the book before I even saw the miniseries. So like that book like truly fucked me up. Now, favorite horror novel. And aside from that, any you'd recommend. So Dan, I want you once again to take the lead, sir.
Novels that I would recommend. I have a buddy, John William Worth. Shout out to you, John. He's got a couple of horror novels out, Nocturne Hall and A Town of Night. And they're pretty good, so I would definitely shout those out. Favorite horror novels? I don't really read a whole lot of horror, to be honest with you. So I'm going to have to go with some of the Goosebump books.
Classic. Nico, how about you?
So I am actually going to shout out The Dumb Witch Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. It is one of the ones that I think is a little less egregious on the racism bit, but it is one of his longer works, and it really just sets such an incredible atmosphere. The descriptions of the, eldritch abominations, as well as just the little ways that everything in the town is just a little bit off, really sticks with you.
And that's kind of what you'd recommend as well?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm going to cop out here. I'm going to be like Nico was in the last part. My favorite horror novel, anyone who's listened to the podcast already knows what my answer is. It's Dracula. I love that book. I read that book every year. That book is amazing. Like my copy's about to fall apart. I'm going to get like a version that's like, like bound in like gold or something. Like that's about to be the next version I get. But another one that is fucking awesome, Salem's Lot by Stephen King. That book is amazing. God, I love that book. I love Salem's Lot so much. So much. And as a Nico, as you were talking about with the Dumb Witch Horror, I did have one H.P. Lovecraft book kind of circling in the back of my mind. I mean, listeners of the pod will have no doubts that we're all big fans of cosmic horror. So obviously, we had to read some parts. So I like to call it Cthulhu.
It's classic.
I think that the descriptions, and again, it's very short. So that would be, now it is way more egregious than the Dumb Witch Horror in terms of ye old racism. But it's kind of one of those things where if you go into it with the understanding that there's no defending it, yes, H.P. Lovecraft was a hyper racist, and you're just reading it. Like, I mean, I personally think that it is quite scary. And the foundation that it laid out for everything else, I think is huge. Absolutely huge. So that's it for me. But yeah, well, that's it from Nico, Dan, and Just. If you like what you've heard, want to drop us a line, let us know some of your favorite horror books, We're on Twitter and Instagram at DOTD Horror. We're also on Facebook, Don't Open That Door. As always, to check out this and any other episodes, you can check out our new website. It's DOTDhorror.com. Until then, that's been it from us. Take care of one another. Who knows? Maybe read a book sometime. And as always, dear listener, don't open that door. Bye.